political wrangling jump off the pages of declassified documents from World War I. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson was re-elected President of the United States on a pledge to keep America out of Europe's devastating war. The United States was totally unprepared for warfare. When American troops finally did get involved, they suffered terrible casualties.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
This is the forgotten story of the secret deals, government mistakes, and political intolerance of the war to end all wars.
There are only two sides, American or traitor.
This is the secrets of World War I, declassified. France, 1917. The world had never seen carnage on this scale. The First World War. The challenge went out to America. Britain and France desperately needed help against Germany and its allies.
They had been at war since August 1914. What they needed most in 1917 was just simply soldiers. They had taken such huge casualties in their units that they really seriously were running out of people, and what they wanted were infantrymen who could carry rifles, machine gunners. Both the French and the British wanted assistance now.
The Great War was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. It was large-scale, mechanized warfare. But in America, the challenge fell on deaf ears. The horrors of war in a distant land were too great.
There was a lot of opposition to the war. In fact, maybe more opposition than we might have thought at one point. Immigrant communities in the northern cities, many people had come to America in part to escape conscription from the European armies.
The problem in 1917 became how to persuade Americans to support the war.
Woodrow Wilson was essential to getting America into the Great War. He had taken a position that America was too proud to fight, that we were going to be neutral, that we would not get involved in this war amongst the European powers.
America stood at a crossroads in 1917. Wilson could either hope for peace or send American soldiers to try and rescue Europe from the devastation of war.
He tried many times to be the peace leader, to broker a peace deal, and nobody wanted to do that because too many people had died. There was going to be a fighting conclusion.
World War I was triggered by a simple murder. In August 1914, a 20-year-old Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne in Sarajevo. The powers of Europe were drawn into the worst war mankind had seen. The spark that set off this powder keg was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the radical nationalists known as the Black Hand.
It's an unorganized group of young men who assassinate a key political figure and realize that assassination is a tool that can be used like warfare. On the other hand, they never anticipated that their assassination would cause worldwide tumult and chaos.
Austria, Germany, and Turkey sided against Russia, France, Italy, and Great Britain. The war soon became a stalemate on the Western Front, with thousands of British, French, and German soldiers dying in the mud and misery of the trenches.
during the war. It was feared, and it was always in the back of everybody's mind that he could end his life strangling to death at the bottom of a trench.
The European powers sought allies beyond the continent.
At the beginning of the war, President Wilson said that the Americans should be neutral in thought as well as in deed. On the other hand, right from the beginning, England in particular was a major trading partner of the United States, always more so than Germany.
For many Americans, World War I introduced the United States as a major player on the world stage. But the declassified record of America's entry and participation in the war tells a tale of infighting, inexperience, and agonizing sacrifice.
The main problem is the American troops weren't ready to enter the trenches. So it's very easy to train soldiers to fire their weapons, wear their uniforms. It's far more difficult to train all the people, all the soldiers in a division to do all the things that they have to do. In terms of training the artillery, training the transportation people, the logisticians to handle the movement of thousands of tons of supplies, that's an enormously difficult operation.
Britain wanted America to join the war on its side. It established a secret operation to manipulate American news coverage of the war.
It gave the British a tremendous advantage. They were able to pretend that they didn't have a propaganda apparatus. In fact, they had probably the biggest propaganda apparatus of any country in the war.
In August 1914, Britain strategically cut many of the communication links in and out of Germany, particularly those going to the United States.
Well, Britain, of course, cut all the cables across the North Sea leading into Germany to cut back on German communications. This was done immediately when the war started. But the transatlantic cables that Britain controlled were always open during the entire war.
This gave Britain a monopoly on war news in America. It established a press bureau that issued updates on the war to hundreds of American newspapers.
They knew exactly what propaganda move worked and what didn't work. And the beauty of it all was that nobody knew they existed.
The propaganda machine churned out stories, mostly false, of German atrocities in Europe, especially in occupied Belgium.
Germans were accused of bayoneting babies, of raping nuns, of doing all sorts of things that later turned out to have been greatly exaggerated.
For the first 3 years of the war, the United States was technically neutral. But American banks were loaning Britain the money to wage war, and American munitions companies were filling unprecedented orders from London.
It was a boom time for U.S. industry because we were producing everything for the Allies: rifles, artillery, munitions, grain, horses, petroleum.
That included poison gas, a new weapon that the United States had not produced before the war.
U.S. manufacturers made some chlorine, which was used for cooling in cooling systems at the time. But the government had to start producing it themselves at an arsenal in Maryland.
The Germans fought back in America by waging a covert campaign of sabotage in munitions factories and at ports where ships loaded weapons bound for Britain and France.
In 1916, a huge amount of ammunition on Black Tom Island off Caven Point blew up with a blast that broke practically every window in Jersey City and in downtown New York. It was a gigantic explosion that lasted almost all night.
By 1917, Despite the propaganda and all the financial and military support the United States was giving the Allies, Britain was on the verge of bankruptcy.
1917 was the tough year. The British authorities, by the end of 1916, were deeply concerned that they were scraping the bottom of the barrel of their financial resources.
The Allies were in danger of collapse. They needed soldiers fast. Secretly, Woodrow Wilson was planning America's entry into the war. Americans had no idea of what was to come. In 1916, Britain and France were struggling to hold the Western Front against Germany. Meanwhile, in America, Woodrow Wilson was a vulnerable president. In 1912, he had won a three-way race with only 42% of the vote. Now, he was re-elected president by a razor-thin margin on an anti-war platform.
Woodrow Wilson ran in 1916 for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," which wasn't the slogan he had favored. He really wanted to run on his domestic record. The 8-hour day, child labor laws, restriction of big business, the so-called trusts.
In his first term and during the campaign, Wilson had condemned all the warring nations and called on them to negotiate a peace without victory. The stories from the battlefield horrified the average American. This was trench warfare, with each side dug in, facing each other. An assault was the only way to break the lines, but the machine guns were waiting. The most fearsome weapon of all was gas.
Gas was first used on the Western Front in the spring of 1915. The gas was chlorine, kind of a primitive form of gas. It was an asphyxiant, but of course the troops who were opposing them, French colonials and Canadians, were not prepared for it. They had to improvise, and they just barely held on, and if the Germans had had sufficient troops to follow up, there might have been a major breakthrough. This triggered a gas war.
Over 9 million soldiers would die before the war was over. Americans were appalled by the mechanized carnage, but many also felt they must take sides.
Wilson's view of the war during his first term was it was a nightmare on both sides. He saw nothing to differentiate the morality of the British and the morality of the Germans.
But secretly, Wilson was pro-British. His mother was English, and he had visited England. He harbored deep suspicions of the German government.
He wanted Britain to win, but he also wanted the U.S. to stay out of it, which was not seen as a contradiction at the time. That was the most popular view among the different views of war in the United States at the time.
Wilson's Democratic Party was filled with anti-war sentiment. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan constantly warned Wilson that Wall Street would drag America into the war. At its convention in Baltimore, the party adopted the slogan, "He kept us out of war," for Wilson's re-election campaign. The Republicans were the party of war. They raged over German submarine attacks on US ships in the Atlantic. Like that on the Lusitania in 1915, in which 128 Americans died.
The Republican Party tended to be more belligerent. Some of its leading figures, for example, former President Theodore Roosevelt detested Wilson.
In January 1917, President Woodrow Wilson was still saying that the US would stay out of the war. but Americans were in harm's way on the high seas.
President Wilson makes his Peace Without Victory speech on January 22nd, 1917. It's his last attempt to avoid a war, but then events take a bad turn for his vision. The first thing that happens is the Germans instantly resume using the submarine warfare, and they start shooting at ships, including ships that include American passengers.
Famous director Cecil B. DeMille portrayed incidents like these in his 1917 film, The Little American, fanning the flames of war. That same month, in the infamous Zimmermann telegram, the German government offered an alliance to Mexico. It dangled the possibility of regaining Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico as bait. Britain intercepted the telegram, decoded it, and gave it to Wilson. He was particularly angry because he had allowed the German embassy to use communication lines from Washington to send coded messages to Berlin.
They've gone to Wilson and said, we can't communicate normally because the British have cut our communications. Can we please use your State Department channels? And Wilson says, yeah, sure. And what are they doing? They're sending messages offering an alliance to Mexico to attack us through that same channel.
On the 2nd of April 1917, just 5 months after his re-election, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. Despite opposition from his own party, Wilson carried the day and Congress declared war on Germany. America was now at war, but both the nation and its president were naive about what was to come.
Woodrow Wilson wasn't aware of how badly the Allies were doing. They had been fairly successful at hiding it. Britain successfully hid its financial problems for the most part until after the American declaration of war.
Neither the president nor the public had any idea how desperate Britain and France were, nor how many American troops would be needed in Europe. The American military was also unprepared. The war in Europe would challenge the American Republic at home. In April 1917, building on Britain's secret propaganda effort, America declared war on Germany. Woodrow Wilson was now a war president, but neither he nor his administration had a war plan. In fact, they had no idea what was to come. That same April, almost 40,000 British soldiers lost their lives in the Battle of Arras in northeastern France. They called it Bloody April. And that was just a fraction of the dead from Verdun and the Somme and countless other battles in the war's first 3 years. Military innovations, from the machine gun to the tank to the aerial bomber, resulted in a level of carnage the world had never seen. On the day that the US Congress declared war on Germany, the 6th of April 1917, the military asked the Senate for $3 billion to build training camps and purchase new weapons for an expanded army.
And the Democratic leader of the US Senate said, "My God, you're not going to send soldiers over there, are you?" Now, if that doesn't prove that we didn't know what we were doing, I don't know what does.
We did not have a modern army. We had to build that from scratch, and it all started on the day America declared war, April 6, 1917.
For nearly 3 years, millions had been fighting and dying in the trenches of Europe. And yet, when the US entered the war, it had virtually no one to send to help.
The American military and political leaders really believed that they would not have to send a single soldier to France.
The U.S. Army in April 1917 was about 128,000 officers and men, and about another 101, maybe 102,000 National Guardsmen. It was a frontier constabulary force, really had no units larger than regiments.
America wasn't prepared for what it got into in April of 1917.
A young major, Douglas MacArthur, wrote a memo challenging the belief that the US would only need 500,000 troops. He argued his case with the Secretary of War. Even President Wilson did not know how badly American troops were needed in Europe.
When Wilson was looking at the Allies in February and March of 1917, it still looked, if not that they were winning, it did not look as if they were losing yet.
A French offensive that spring crumbled into disaster, bringing with it desertions and mutiny involving tens of thousands of troops. In the Alps, Italian troops were deserting as well, giving assault plans to their Austrian adversaries. And on the Eastern Front, catastrophe in the Russian army was not far off.
The Russian Revolution occurred in March of 1917, but their military collapse came months after that.
At first, Wilson believed a volunteer army would do. But Americans greeted the declaration of war with resistance. First enlistments totaled only 73,000.
Woodrow Wilson was initially opposed to conscription. It had only really been used once before in the Civil War, which had not gone well, causing riots and such in New York City.
He thinks it goes against American tradition. He thinks that it will make America like European countries where people are forced to fight, and that didn't represent what this country was about.
By May 1917, Wilson had changed his mind when it became clear that without conscription, America could not raise the army necessary to make a difference in the war. The draft was instituted, but not without a huge fight in Congress and in the country.
We have very high rates of desertion, exemptions, people trying to avoid the draft.
Wilson soon became aware just how desperate things were for his new allies.
The French sent General Joffre, who had been the commander of their armies at the time of the beginning of the war. Joffre said, well, you know, this is all very good. You'll contribute money, you'll contribute materiel, but what we want is men. We need men. We must have men. Because the French were suffering disastrous casualties, they needed American soldiers.
Wilson had led Americans to believe that the war was as good as won. But in truth, the Allies were holding on by a thread.
The British wanted 500,000 Americans drafted immediately and shipped to England. You don't have to train them. They said, we'll train them and we'll put them in the British Army, commanded by British officers, and make them into cannon fodder like they'd made all their own men.
Wilson also did not know the extent of the secret deals between the Allies for carving up Europe, the Middle East, and Africa after the war.
Woodrow Wilson didn't know the specifics of the secret treaties, but he certainly suspected there were some agreements. He knew that Britain and France and their allies were fighting not necessarily or not at all for particularly pure reasons. There were commercial reasons, there were strategic reasons, there were reasons of territory, reasons of revenge.
The president rejected Britain's request to train and command American troops. Instead, he appointed General John Pershing to lead the American Expeditionary Force.
General Pershing was a career Army officer who served out on the frontier initially. He was at one time the captain of a company of Indian scouts in the Sioux Territory. He was at Wounded Knee. He was later on a horse next to Teddy Roosevelt on San Juan Hill in Cuba.
In June 1917, Pershing arrived in France without an army. British and French leaders were furious.
Woodrow Wilson and his Secretary of War gave Pershing specific instructions to set up an independent American army, which Wilson needed in order to have a strong voice in the peace negotiations that he knew would eventually arise.
Wilson was already thinking about his role on the world stage after the war.
Without an independent American army, the United States would not have an important voice, so we had to have that army.
Pershing told Britain and France it would take another year for his army to get into the fight. He met King George V. It had been rumored that 50,000 American warplanes were on their way to Europe. In reality, America had only 55 training planes. Pershing informed the king that no planes would be sent for some time to come. The Allies were shocked. They told Pershing they didn't know how much longer they could hold out. Summer 1917. While America attempted to build a fighting army and the Allies hung on by a thread, opponents of the war raged against President Wilson.
The anti-war movement was pretty strong when America entered World War I. There were many people who didn't support this war. They were progressive politicians and progressive activists who had supported all kinds of government reforms earlier in the 20th century who thought this was a bad war. It was a war that would lead to needless death. It was a war that was being fought in the name of business rather than really democracy, and they opposed it. So you had progressives like Robert La Follette in the Senate, or you had progressive activists like Jane Addams, who didn't support what this was about. You also had socialists, such as Eugene Debs, a labor leader who didn't think this would be in the interests of working men. So there were many different kinds of opponents. There were also many Irish Americans, there were many German Americans who had ambivalent feelings about this war.
Many groups opposed the war, resisting conscription and marching in the streets.
Hyphenated Americanism was a common idea during this period, and it meant that either if you were naturalized or you weren't, and you had been an immigrant, that you weren't fully American, that you were either an Irish American, you were an Italian American, and that meant, to some, you weren't fully loyal to the country. You weren't American. And throughout World War I, you have all kinds of incidents against German Americans, Irish Americans, because they are hyphenated Americans. Sometimes it is violent.
Another very powerful force in the anti-war movement were the ethnics of the United States, particularly the German Americans, who were the largest ethnic group in the United States. There were 8.5 million of them, and also the most prosperous, and the Irish Americans, who were absolutely livid at the thought of going into a war to support England. They still remembered their hundreds of years of oppression under English rule in Ireland, and so they were totally opposed to this. They represented a very formidable element in the anti-war picture, particularly because they controlled hundreds of thousands, even millions of votes. And Wilson did not endear himself to either one of them when he accused American ethnics of pouring poison into the veins of American life.
To make matters worse, things were not going well for America's allies on the battlefield. American supporters of the war were becoming increasingly nervous about this state of affairs.
The actual course of the war, the fall of 1917 to the spring of 1918, was the period of maximum danger for the Allies, because even once the United States was involved in the war, we had hardly any army to speak of to begin with.
Casualties were so severe and trench warfare so punishing that morale among Italian, French and British forces was crumbling.
The Allies had suffered a number of horrendous defeats in both Italy and in Flanders and in France. There were major mutinies in the French army. The British suffered enormous losses at the Third Battle of Ypres, or Passchendaele, in the fall of 1917. And also, of course, you have to remember that the Russian Revolution occurred, and Russia, by the spring of 1918, had pulled out of the war. The German troops that were fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front were now free to be brought over to the Western Front, and as many as 2 million more German troops were available for combat in France, and the Germans launched a series of major offensives that came very close to puncturing the Allied lines and drove the British way back.
Because of this grim news from the front, Americans from all walks of life were nervous about sending troops to Europe. There was even widespread resistance to the war in the rural South and among religious groups.
When we went into World War I, this was not a popular war, and this is something that Wilson had to deal with.
One of Wilson's first moves was to create a propaganda machine, the Committee for Public Information, headed by a Colorado newspaperman named Yauuቍļc. The committee flooded America's newspapers with pro-government articles about the war, and eventually set up a newspaper of its own, with Wilson's approval.
He hated all reporters. He thought they were ignoramuses. So he thought this was what we really should have, a government-run newspaper.
The committee also created the 4-Minute Men, who spread pro-war propaganda in short speeches between reels in cinemas.
And in that 4-minute period, men were trained to then get up and to give a short, pithy, precise pitch for the war, for recruitment, for war bonds, for whatever the cause might be.
Hollywood stars joined the war bond campaign. Wilson's government also began a crackdown on anyone who spoke out against the war effort. He approved the creation of the American Protective League, volunteers working with the Attorney General to enforce the war effort.
They would conduct slacker raids to try to find out who was avoiding draft duty. They would try to intimidate people who weren't buying Liberty bonds, which the government was selling to raise money for the war. They would go into public schools and try to overhear if people were talking badly against the war, and they would report it to the government.
By June 1917, 250,000 agents of the American Protective League were battling dissent across the nation. Americans were spying on Americans. That same month, President Wilson signed the Espionage Act.
And the law empowers the federal government to go after people who were opposing the war. Either people who were speaking out against the war or people who were sending material through the mail.
The US government was especially uneasy about dissent among African Americans, who were still deprived of the vote in the South.
When America went to war in the name of democracy, and when African Americans were part of the wartime effort, many African Americans said, why is there democracy abroad? Why are we fighting for that in Europe, but not here in the United States?
The crackdown in the black community frequently led to violence. The worst was in Houston in August 1917, when black soldiers in training saw a white police officer abuse a black woman.
They grabbed the cop and shook him until his teeth rattled, apparently, and maybe slugged him a couple of times. And the next thing you know, there were other cops beating the hell out of these black soldiers. They went back to their camp outside Houston. They told what had happened, and quite a few of them reached for their rifles.
41 black soldiers were eventually imprisoned for the attacks, and 13 were hanged. Other targets of repression included the radical union movement, led by the WW1s, the industrial workers of the world. German Americans also fell victim to the growing war rage.
There's one case in St. Louis where a German American is wrapped in an American flag by a mob, carried through the streets, and lynched.
A battle was raging in America, but in Europe, American soldiers were still nowhere to be seen. The death toll was mounting on the front line, with millions dead. The 2 million Americans who would eventually fight in Europe would face unimaginable horrors. In autumn 1917, small numbers of American troops finally began to arrive in Europe, but not enough to make a difference. General Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, spent much of the next year getting his soldiers trained and arguing strategy with his British and French counterparts. Pershing was an uncompromising, stubborn leader who believed that France and Britain had made mistakes on the battlefield.
So when the Americans first started coming, there was a huge debate amongst the Americans and on one side and the French and the British on the other, with the Americans saying, especially General John J. Pershing, that the United States forces would in fact train, prepare themselves, and once they were fully organized and fully prepared, they would enter battle.
They wanted to ship us out and break us up and put us into the French and English units. And John Pershing, Blackjack, wouldn't stand for it. He said, no, Americans are going to fight as Americans, so we don't lose our identity.
The US was slow to build training camps, and when training did begin in earnest, sickness ravaged the recruits.
Most of the deaths in the US in training were from disease. Of the 120 some odd thousand casualties, death casualties, suffered by the AEF, 60,000 were mainly from the effects of influenza. It was a really serious problem. Of course, in the days before antibiotics, there was no cure.
The worldwide flu pandemic hit soldiers in US training camps.
There is no place more perfect for spreading a communicable disease than a cramped military camp. 30,000 American troops in training in America died from the influenza.
In Europe, the Allies were suffering terrible losses at the Second Battle of Ypres and at Passchendaele. By January 1918, America still had only 4 divisions in the war, just over 100,000 troops. Their morale was low, and they made little difference in the fighting.
The slow arrival of American troops in France was one of the forgotten scandals of the war. So the French really almost went berserk. They started, there was a serious attempt in France at this time because they decided the Americans were a bunch of fakes and they never were going to send any men. Within the French government, there was a serious attempt to negotiate a peace with the Germans.
The real secret of the war lay inside Germany. The German economy was collapsing. Under pressure from the British naval blockade, food was becoming scarce. Hunger and malnutrition were rampant, and discontent skyrocketed.
There was no coal to heat their houses. They were living on turnips. There's no meat to be found. Airplanes were having trouble flying because rubber for tires, even petroleum to keep them in the air, was in very, very short supply.
Despite being short on supplies and morale, Germany pushed forward on the battlefield. But in the spring and summer of 1918, American troops finally began to make a difference.
At this point, in late May 1918, Germany is indisputably winning World War I. But something changes. General Pershing, who had just started to move his 1st Division out into the Somme sector, also sends 2 divisions, almost 60,000 men. They plug the gap. And from that point in history, there are no more German breakthroughs in World War I.
Like all the armies in World War I, American troops used poison gas as a weapon. American casualties from enemy gas attacks were particularly high.
By the time American troops were fighting fully in the summer of 1918, gas had been used for almost 3 years on the Western Front. It was one of the things that the headstrong Americans wouldn't learn about, or learned about only through bitter experience. So actually a high proportion of American casualties were gas casualties. It's just that gas was particularly effective against green and untried troops, as the Americans were.
Mustard gas would burn you wherever you were moist. I mean, on your lips, your nose, your eyes, on your arms, and your groin. In fact, when I was in the hospital, I saw guys laying there spread eagle on the bed, in their groin, and their arms, and their eyes, and their nose, and their mouth was just red, puffed up, swollen and red from mustard gas.
Over 70,000 US troops were gassed, and of those, 1,500 died. General Pershing implored the American public to back the troops.
3,000 miles from home, an American army is fighting for you. Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake. The army asks your unthinking support to the end that the high ideals for which America stands may endure upon the earth.
By July 1918, America had managed to put 2 million men into combat. They fought for just 200 days, but they turned the tide of the war.
The actual fighting, the heavy bombardment and all that the Germans made on July 14th, that was the start of French Bastille Day. That was the start of the Germans' last drive. And from there on, we knocked the tar out of them and kept them a-going until the war was over.
In September 1918, in the Ein Marne offensive, more than 90,000 American soldiers were killed or wounded. The final push came in the Argonne Forest. The fighting went on for weeks, and American soldiers struggled, starved, and died.
It's very difficult for the Americans, but it occurs at a time when the Allies have the initiative. The German army is beginning to disintegrate. And in many ways, it really is the drive of the Americans toward the North that forced the Germans to realize that they are facing a terrible disaster and really have to do something to end this war.
On the morning of the 11th of November 1918, Sergeant Ralph Forderhays was leading a squad of American soldiers on the east bank of the River Meuse in northern France. In dense fog, they stumbled upon 2 German soldiers manning a machine gun. The Germans did not shoot. Forderhays asked them why. "The war is ending at 11 this morning," they told him. "No need to sacrifice our lives or yours needlessly." Germany and her allies had collapsed, and an armistice had been declared.
Suddenly, something was wrong, and I stopped dead in my tracks, and I couldn't figure out what it was for maybe 5 or 6 seconds. It was that dramatic. The firing had stopped.
America's 6 months of fighting in World War I were at an end. More than 50,000 American soldiers had been killed, and almost 200,000 wounded. Another 60,000 were dead from disease. Woodrow Wilson had claimed that the war would make the world safe for democracy. But instead, the Great War had turned the world on its head. It had destroyed the German monarchy, the Russian monarchy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. The British Empire was mortally wounded. More than 9 million soldiers were dead, and the world would soon be at war again.
And that's where we come to the end of the History Channel for another night. We'll be back at 8 in the morning with the story of a cook who spread time.
France, 1917. The world had never seen carnage on this scale. The First World War. The challenge went out to America. Britain and France desperately needed help against Germany and its allies.
They had been at war since August 1914. What they needed most in 1917 was just simply soldiers. They had taken such huge casualties in their units that they really seriously were running out of people, and what they wanted were infantrymen who could carry rifles, machine gunners. Both the French and the British wanted assistance now.
The Great War was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. It was large-scale, mechanized warfare. But in America, the challenge fell on deaf ears. The horrors of war in a distant land were too great.
There was a lot of opposition to the war. In fact, maybe more opposition than we might have thought at one point. Immigrant communities in the northern cities, many people had come to America in part to escape conscription from the European armies.
The problem in 1917 became how to persuade Americans to support the war.
Woodrow Wilson was essential to getting America into the Great War. He had taken a position that America was too proud to fight, that we were going to be neutral, that we would not get involved in this war amongst the European powers.
America stood at a crossroads in 1917. Wilson could either
worldwide tumult and chaos.
Austria, Germany, and Turkey sided against Russia, France, Italy, and Great Britain. The war soon became a stalemate on the Western Front, with thousands of British, French, and German soldiers dying in the mud and misery of the trenches.
During the war, it was feared, and it was always in the back of everybody's mind that he could end his life strangling to death at the bottom of a trench.
The European powers sought allies beyond the continent.
At the beginning of the war, President Wilson said that the Americans should be neutral in thought as well as in deed. On the other hand, right from the beginning, England in particular was a major trading partner of the United States, always more so than Germany.
For many Americans, World War I introduced the United States as a hope for peace, or send American soldiers to try and rescue Europe from the devastation of war.
He tried many times to be the peace leader, to broker a peace deal, and nobody wanted to do that because too many people had died. There was going to be a fighting conclusion.
World War I was triggered by a simple murder. In August 1914, a 20-year-old Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne in Sarajevo. The powers of Europe were drawn into the worst war mankind had seen. The spark that set off this powder keg was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the radical nationalists known as the Black Hand.
It's an unorganized group of young men who assassinate a key political figure and realize that assassination is a tool that can be used like warfare. On the other hand, they never anticipated that their assassination would cause world war.
Political wrangling jump off the pages of declassified documents from World War I.
In 1916, Woodrow Wilson was re-elected President of the United States on a pledge to keep America out of Europe's devastating war. The United States was totally unprepared for warfare. When American troops finally did get involved, they suffered terrible casualties.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
This is the forgotten story of the secret deals, government mistakes, and political intolerance of the war to end all wars.
There are only two sides, American or traitor.
This is the secrets of World War I, declassified.